Old pond, a frog jumps in, water's sound. Welcome to Haiku Chronicles. I'm Donna Beaver. Here with me today is Alan Pizzarelli. This episode of Haiku Chronicles takes us back to 1686 in Japan, when the opening poem in this episode was written by the first great Japanese master of haiku, Matsuo Basho. A haiku is a short poem recording the essence of a moment keenly perceived in which nature is linked to human nature. Al, tell us about this haiku by Basho.
Well, it's probably the most well-known haiku around the world today. What is not as well-known about this haiku is the interesting history behind it. The first great modern master of haiku, Matsuo Basho, tells us in his essay, Furu-Ike-Ya, that when Basho first wrote this haiku, it enlightened him to the power of nature in haiku. It convinced him to, quote, submit to nature, return to nature, unquote. Basho had never before written a haiku like Old Pond. When he did, he realized he had broken new wood. It was innovative, and it marked a new style of haiku for him. Up to that time, he supposed something great should be made up to make a poem interesting. Whereas this new haiku was a direct observation of a moment in nature, written sonomama, which means just as it is, in present tense, without any unnecessary word, without adding any poetic devices, intellectual statements, or made-up ideas. It's like Bruce Lee said in Enter the Dragon, to the Kung Fu student. It is like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger, or you will miss all that heavenly glory.
Again, it's direct observation. Also up to that time, the mention of frogs was uncommon in Japanese literature. The uta poets of the day wrote mostly about fancy birds, or like the hototogisu, or beautiful flowers, of course, like the cherry blossoms. When frogs were mentioned, they were portrayed with an association with human condition, like war, or they were given human attributes. Whereas Basho's haiku portrayed the true nature of the frog.
That's right. In Basho's time, as in our own, poets and scholars always tend to attach some deeper, otherworldly, esoteric meanings to this haiku. And that's okay, but we should be mindful of Basho's Zen philosophy, which would point out the real meaning of Old Pond, a frog jumps in. Water's sound is simply this: the sound of a frog jumping into the water. Nothing more, nothing less.
That's right, so less is more.
It's what Basho called without ideas, which means nature itself.
These thoughts are very like as in my own Alaskan Native culture and other North American Indian tribes. It's really being one with nature. There's no real separation of man from the earth, and we all consider her caregivers. So Basho was really very native in his thinking. It's one of the reasons I'm drawn to haiku and the Japanese poetic forms. When I hear this haiku by Basho, it takes us directly to a moment in nature, and that's how haiku poetry links us to nature. By the way, Al, let's talk about the urban legend of 575.
Yeah, let's do that.
One of the most common misunderstandings about English language haiku is that it is a strict 17-syllable form divided into 3 lines of 575 syllables. This was really the result of early mistranslations, equating the Japanese onji or sound symbol with the English language syllable. We have found since then that the Japanese sound symbols do not really correspond to the Western notion of the syllable.
That's right. And, so you'd get things like old, dark, sleepy poem,
Right.
But if you look at the literal translations, Furu-Ike, Old Pond, Ya, Kawazu, frog, Tobai Kamu, jump in, Mizu no Oto, water's sound. One can see how English translation into 17 syllables would need to add words that are not even in the original poem in order to fit that 575 format in English.
Right, so really a truer approximation is closer to around 12 English syllables, which is more or less how contemporary poets write them today.
Exactly, that's right. And, it should also be pointed out at the same time that the haiku can and are written in the 575 form, and that's fine if it falls naturally in that form. One good example off the top of my head, Donna, is a well-known haiku by J.W. Hackett. A bitter morning, sparrows sitting together without any necks.
I love that haiku. And some of the poems I've written were naturally suited for 575s. It really all depends on what each individual poem calls for.
Right. Each haiku moment is a thing in itself and should be treated as itself. One problem that often arises when writing strictly in the 575 form is that the poet is often forced to pad the poem with unnecessary words, and in doing so can often limit the poem's suggestiveness.
Right. And keeping in line with form, many of the English language haiku is written in 1, 2, or 3 lines. Here's an example from the haiku anthology by the late American haiku poet John Wills. The sun lights up a distant ridge, another.
And here's another by haiku poet Michael McClintock. A poppy, a field of poppies, the hills blowing with poppies.
You can see in that poem, too, there's also typically a seasonal reference.
Yeah, well, since the primary focus of haiku is on nature, seasons will more often not reveal themselves in the imagery of the poem. In Hackett's haiku, a bitter morning with the sparrows all huddling together and, implies winter. McClintock's poppies implies summer. Whereas the Wills haiku is considered all year as it deals with the sun and the heavens.
Getting back to Basho's frog, his enlightenment was the real beginning in developing concrete principles for haiku as an art form. Many people may think principles are confining or finite, but they're not. Take a look at Northwest Coastal art of the Tlingit and Tsimshian tribes that I belong to. The Northwest Coast tribal design principles are really important in the design of our totemic art. For instance, it's the Frog Clan design, which would be under the raven, for a mast, totem pole, did not follow the design principles of the ovoid shapes and curves or form. It would no longer be Northwest Coastal tribal art. All of the Northwest Coast tribes, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, the Haida, follow these principles, yet every piece of atu, which is regalia, and tribal carving is different. Therefore, within these limitations, there's also this great freedom.
Right, and that's exactly what the late great poet Richard Wilbur was alluding to when he said, quote, limitations make for power. And no other poetic form, in my opinion, can take us so vividly and directly to nature the way that haiku can, which is especially important now in this century as we face enormous environmental crises of our planet. In this respect, haiku poetry provides us with an appreciation, enlightenment, and reverence for the planet on which we live.
Which brings us back again to Basho's enlightenment regarding haiku. His words are still relevant today. It's a reminder to submit to nature, return to nature. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Haiku Chronicles. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes where we will further discuss haiku poetry and its related forms. For more on Haiku Chronicles, visit www.haikuchronicles.com. Opening and closing music, Mount Fuji by World Sounds.